All right, I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. John Neustadt. He's the founder and president of the dietary supplement company, Nutritional Biochemistry, Inc. Dr. Neustadt started NBI in 2006, where when he couldn't find products with the doses or combinations of nutrients that were shown in clinical trials to work, and subsequently received more than a dozen US FDA orphan drug designations for the potential treatment of rare diseases using natural products through his company. He is a member of the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation Corporate Advisory Roundtable and has written 4 books and over 100 research reviews. Visit his booth for a free copy of his newest book. Here's Dr. Neustadt.
I had to unmute myself. Can you hear me? Is it on? I am so excited to do this talk now after hearing Dr. Rothenberg's talk earlier, because of what he talked about in terms of the role of toxic exposures in the environment and diet, and with ultra processed foods. It really, for me, those are toxic exposures, as you'll understand as I go through. Like, a few things that I do want to mention that are not in my talk, but he opened my awareness to and my eyes to, is as he was talking about preeclampsia and gestational diabetes and low sperm count. I'm suddenly searching for those were questions I was asking and seeing if there was some association between ultra processed foods prior to and during pregnancy, ultra processed food consumption, and those issues. And indeed there is in the research that's also shown. What the research shows with that and with many other diseases that are now associated with ultra processed food consumption, similar to what I talked about yesterday with medication-induced osteoporosis, it's that there's a dose response. So the higher the exposure, the greater the consumption, the greater the risk or the association with these diseases. Most of the research that I'll be presenting is epidemiological research, but fortunately, a couple of years ago, the first controlled clinical trial was done out of the NIH, where they actually had the volunteers live at the NIH, and they gave them specifically controlled diets. And so it's fascinating. For me, it was fascinating to read that research. And basically, look, these days, if it comes in a package, it's going to be ultra processed foods. There are 10,000 chemicals in the US food system now, and about 71% of packaged foods are considered ultra processed foods. Those are my disclosures. I went over those yesterday's. So there's a classification system called NOVA. It's not an acronym. It is just NOVA. And it was created by Carlos Monteiro out of Brazil. And it's really not necessarily the food processing that is the issue, because if you look at food processing, it's a spectrum of processing. Fermentation is food processing, right? But we know that fermented foods are healthy. So pickles are technically processed food. So it's really the amount of processing that goes on, and if novel new ingredients are added. And really, with ultra processed food, is what you're looking at is a production process where they're taking original whole food, you're deconstructing it into its component pieces: fat, carbohydrate, protein, starches, for example. And then they're chemically modifying those and then repackaging them into novel products. And that tends to not only change the nutritional profile, but it also changes the experience. So they're engineering foods for mouthfeel, for taste, right? And in fact, as I'll review in one of the slides, there was a definition of addiction that was defined for tobacco industry, for the tobacco and the tobacco industry. And ultra processed foods meets that definition for addiction. Prior to just a few years ago, it was thought that the obesity epidemic was primarily caused by the rise in sugar consumption, and that the problem with ultra processed food was low fiber, high carbohydrate, high sugar. But actually now what we're realizing, what the research is showing, that it's more than that. It's all of these chemicals that are added, the emulsifiers, the artificial flavors, the artificial colors, all of those and more are having biological impacts and physiological impacts that's affecting health. So here's the NOVA classification system. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but what you see is the minimally processed foods here. So fresh or, or frozen, dried fruits, vegetables, grains, what everybody kind of, I think, understands. And then processed culinary ingredients like olive oil, coconut oil, like butter, lard, maple syrup. And then you get more processing like canning and pickling, smoking of meats. And then ultra processed. So you get an extraction and chemical modification of substances like I mentioned, and assembly of unmodified and modified food substances and additives, pre-frying, molding, extrusion. That's the definition that's being used commonly within the research community to define what ultra-processed foods are. So those are soft drinks and breakfast cereals, fast foods, instant soups, flavored yogurt, hot dogs, all of those things fit that ultra-processed food category. The UPF consumption in the US has been going up as it has been globally. What we see is that when ultra-processed foods are introduced into food systems around the world, they're displacing the native diets and native food systems. And part of it is because of the packaging, which is very appealing. And so people they're more attracted to it. They're incredibly cheap and convenient. So people who are pressed for time or have little money it's a more attractive purchase for them. And so even in the US, communities that are lower economic, lower socioeconomic, and lower educational communities and status within the United States are also more affected by UPF consumption, or consuming a higher percentage of their calories from UPFs than higher socioeconomic, higher educational levels within the United States. And that seems to be the trend globally as well. In fact, now in the United States, about 60% of all calories are considered UPF in the US. So what you see also, that trend in terms of demographics plays out when you look at supermarkets. So if you look at Target versus Walmart, you have Target has 40 to 42% higher UPF, meaning on the shelves, more UPF than Whole Foods. And UPF markers, so those are the chemical constituents that are looked at, the flavors, the food colorings, the ingredients, so higher UPF markers as well. And in fact, 58% approximately of staples in the US in the leading supermarkets are ultra processed, which is higher than in Europe, 41% more than in Europe. Like I mentioned, inverse association between income and education and UPF consumption. So what we see in the trends of UPF consumption is an increasing trend towards more UPF consumption between 2001 to 2002, and then more recently, 2017 to 2018, an increase of about 3.5% more calories coming from UPFs in 2017 and 2018 than about, 16 years ago. And so it's displacing, if you're eating some calories from one source, you're necessarily eating less calories from a different source. And so what that's doing, it's displacing healthier foods, minimally processed foods, for example, are going down. So these are the trends from 2001 to 2018. You're getting increased consumptions of the easily consumable, fast, convenient foods, instant soups, canned soups, cakes, shelf-stable meals, sandwiches, those sorts of things, and decreased consumptions of, which is positive, less sodas, less non-carbonated sweet drinks, fewer breakfast cereals and breads, but also decreased intakes of minimally processed meats and poultries. But you're getting higher intakes of the animal fats and plant oils that are the main drivers of increases in dietary intake. And one of those plant oils that has seen a rapid increase, or a big increase during this time, is palm oil. So that we know is not healthy for cardiovascular risk, and increases triglycerides, increases some of those those risk factors that we know of for cardiovascular disease. And so you're getting healthier oils like olive oil being displaced by other unhealthier oils like corn oil and palm oil. So the hallmarks of UPS: industrial formulated, easy to consume, highly profitable. They're branded products. They're made from low cost ingredients, so that their profit margins are quite high for these companies. Typically contain 5 or more ingredients, but that's not something you can bank on, meaning it's not the identifier. If you say, well, it just has 4 ingredients or 3 ingredients, it could still be an ultra processed food. Often contains artificial ingredients like artificial colors and sweeteners, flavors, preservatives, thickeners, emulsifiers, and other additives. And that's to really improve the look, the feel, the mouth feel, the taste. But also some of these chemicals are used purely just for the manufacturing process, just so that it can go through the machinery and be molded into the final product, so it has the shape for the package or for whatever shape they want to give it, without having necessarily any nutritional value or any thought towards that being a nutritional component of the final product. Like I mentioned, low cost, convenient, heavy marketing, long shelf life. So what's the impact? These are energy dense, not surprising, high calories, low nutritional value. So studies in countries around the world, Brazil, Canada, Taiwan, the US, and elsewhere showed that the more UPF somebody consumes, the less protein they consume, the less fiber they consume, the less vitamins like vitamin A, B complex vitamins, minerals, calcium, iron, you can see the list there, phytoestrogens, and the worse their dietary pattern is. So they're getting less potassium, and 7 studies in 11 countries show that it displaces the nutritional quality. It deteriorates the nutritional quality. So there's no ambiguity here in any of the research about what's going on. And in fact, as we look, and as I was looking at Dr. Rothenberg's slides, and we're seeing, as you're getting through the 1990s and into, current, years, that one of the things that's happening during that time period is the rapid rise of UPFs and the rapid adoption of UPF foods within the United States. And so that there's a very strong correlation between that and the rise in not just obesity and diabetes, but as the research that I'll review, many other diseases as well. I mentioned dose-response relationship. So the more somebody consumes a UPF, the more likely they are going to get excessive consumption of sugars. In fact, 82% of people in the U.S. are in the upper quintile of UPF consumption are getting excessive sugar, which is considered to be more than 10% of total calories. They're getting excessive trans and saturated fats, excessive sodium, and excessive energy density. But this is only, I think, part of the picture. And this is typically what's talked about. This is what is up till now had the majority of the focus of the ratio of sugars and fats and sodium, but the underlying mechanisms behind the health impacts are more subtle and more complicated than just looking at those. So dietary contributions of non-communicable diseases, it was mentioned a little bit in the keynote, but dietary risk factors account for 22% of all adult deaths globally and 15% of disability adjusted life years. According to the World Health Organization, non-communicable diseases account for 74% of all deaths globally, and 80% are considered premature. Now, if you were to take 22% of those and say, okay, let's assume this is accurate. Now, 22% of those are due just to diet. I mean, that's hundreds of millions of people. So there is a significant dose response relationships with UPF consumption has been identified for all of these conditions: ADHD, cancer, frailty, metabolic syndrome, osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, etc. So let's look at obesity first of all. So 43 studies. One of the challenges, though, to be aware of in these studies is there's not a consensus of how to evaluate the dose or the amount of UPFs that people are consuming. So some studies will look and report the percent of total calories. Some studies will report the mass, the number of grams of UPF as a percentage of the total food consumed. Other studies will talk about the number of servings of UPF. So just understand that there's some heterogeneity in how the data are being presented and evaluated, but overwhelmingly, regardless of how you're slicing the data, how slicing that loaf of bread, the conclusions are all the same. The more you eat, the worse the outcomes. So just getting over 29% of calories from UPF is associated with an increased risk of obesity compared to consuming less. There's an error on the slide. This S should be an F. That should be UPF, right? Similar all-cause mortality, getting over 35.7%, so about 36% of calories or eating it more than 5 times a day is significantly increases risk of all-cause mortality. And remember what I said, now about 60% of calories in the US diet are from UPFs. So as a whole, on average, many people are getting much more than these lower thresholds. Metabolic syndrome, in terms of looking at the amounts consumed, higher amount is associated with higher metabolic syndrome risk, at 81% increased risk compared to lower amounts. Each 10% increase in UPF consumption increases risk of metabolic syndrome or prevalence of metabolic syndrome by 4%. ADHD. This was a case-controlled study. There were a couple that have been done, and a cross-sectional study that has been done. And essentially, it's looking at processed foods and processed sweets. And all of those are associated with increased risk for ADHD. Primarily, the outcomes are not as clear in this because when you look at evaluations by a healthcare practitioner, the results are not consistent. But when we're looking at self-reported observations from parents of when they see behavioral changes in their children after consuming these foods, there is consistency in those findings. And I can tell you, as a matter of fact, with a child with ADHD, I experienced this with her. And yet when we take her to her doctor and get evaluated, she wasn't consuming those sweets right before going in. She could have conversations and also be aware that the way that ADHD presents in girls is very different than how it presents in boys. It's often underdiagnosed and missed in girls. So we would see this in her and it would be like a whole nother personality come out. But I'm convinced that if then she was taken and sat down with her doctor to have an official evaluation, they would have never seen the difference. They wouldn't have noticed the difference because it was in a very artificial controlled setting. But when it's the parents that are reporting the results and the behavioral changes, there is consistency in the research of what they're seeing. So in this study, this first study here, you're seeing a positive association with sugary foods, dairy products, and chocolate. In the third tertile of processed food sweets had an odds ratio for ADHD of 2.646. Huge increase relative to lower amounts. Also, summary findings in this second study: processed meats, fried foods. They called it puffed foods. This was not done in the US. Sugared beverages and candies were also positively associated with ADHD. And then a cross-sectional study of 1,700 Israeli parents with 123 self-reporting the diagnosis of ADHD showed that for each 5% of ultra-processed food presented as grams consumed over the total amount of food was associated with a 10% increase in ADHD risk, which is interesting to me because it's similar with this, essentially you get an increment of 5% or even just 10%, which isn't a lot, and you're seeing these increase prevalence of ADHD, and in this case, metabolic syndrome. Frailty. Frailty is a risk for dying from osteoporosis. It's a risk for fragility fractures. It's one of the major risks for fractures from osteoporosis, and ultra processed foods are associated with frailty. And this is how frailty is diagnosed: exhaustion, muscle weakness, low physical activity, etc. Higher versus lower consumption of UPF. So just 28% of calories on the lower threshold compared to less than 12% was associated with a 367% increased risk of frailty. And what do we see in many of these communities that elderly are living in, that where their diets are not well controlled? They're not able to cook as easily as they used to for themselves. They're eating a higher percentage of ultra processed foods, especially in nursing homes, where costs for housing these individuals and Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements are low. That the food costs, also the money they have to spend for foods, they're looking for the lowest cost alternative to feed these patients. And so they tend to be high in sugar, high in fat, again, calorically dense and nutrient poor foods, which is just contributing more to these problems in this population. GI disorders and cardiovascular disease. So not just with irritable bowel syndrome, but with acid reflux, you have increased UPF consumption is associated with both of those. With cardiovascular disease, increased higher UPF consumption is associated with that. When you see here a 10% increase in the proportion of UPF gives you a 12% increase for coronary heart disease risk, and a hazard ratio 10% increase in the proportion of UPF. So just increasing by 10% increases your risk for coronary heart disease, or is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease by 12%, and an increased risk of cerebrovascular disease by 11%. So this is something that is really no, I'm misreading this sign. I'm sorry. Coronary heart disease by 13%. This is what happens when I don't break these out into separate bullet points. And then 11% for cerebrovascular disease. Overall cancers, higher consumption. I feel like a broken record. The more you consume, the bigger the problems you've got. Prostate cancer, though, there's no association shown in the literature with prostate cancer. But there is for breast cancer consumption. And this, they looked at frequency. So consuming it less than 5 days a week compared to consuming ultra-processed foods more than 5 days per week is considered a factor for consuming it more than 5 days a week is a risk factor, increasing the risk of breast cancer with an odds ratio of 2.35. Depression and anxiety. Multiple studies have been done with this as well. The second bullet point, every 10% increase in UPF consumption per daily calories gives it an 11% higher depression risk. Right? Higher consumption of UPF also correlates with elevated internalizing symptoms. So boredom, crying, fear, worry, loneliness, unhappiness, poor sleep, and sadness. Cognitive decline. So multi-center prospective studies done in Brazil, over 10,000 patients. They use food frequency questionnaires, which I think we all know that some of the limitations of that. But what they saw is that as a percentage of daily calories, the more that somebody consumed, the greater their risk of cognitive decline, just even above the first quartile. Consuming above the first quartile of UPF was associated with a 28% faster cognitive decline and a 25% faster reduction or decline in executive function. Osteoporosis, getting more than 57.5% of calories from ultra-processed foods associated with an increased osteoporosis risk with an odds ratio of about 1.79. Now, the data, when they looked at this, was interesting. They parsed it out with also looking at physical activity. So if they have low UPF consumption with physical activity, and they're comparing that to people with low UPF consumption and low physical activity, and high UPF consumption and low physical activity. So people had high UPF consumption and they didn't exercise enough, had the worst odds ratio for osteoporosis of 4.225. If you had low UPF and low physical activity, still had an elevated odds ratio of osteoporosis. And if your serum vitamin D was low, even when you had high UPF, you had even a higher odds ratio of osteoporosis as well. Now, low defined as less than 30. So we all, or less than 20, I'm sorry, is what's defined as low. We all know that it definitely needs to be higher than that. So this is a clinical trial that I talked about, and I want to spend some time on this because this is just a brilliant clinical trial by Dr. Hall and his colleagues. They did it at the NIH, and the NIH has facilities where they can live in. They have professional chefs, so they constructed these diets to be calorically equal, one with UPF, one whole foods, and to have certain ratios of sodium and sugar in the UPF diets and other components of it to really look not only at how fast the eating speed of how fast somebody ate, because one of the hypotheses is that when people are eating UPFs, because they tend to be low fiber, they're not chewing very long, so they're eating faster, they're swallowing faster, so the satiety signals are not having time to increase, so they're not getting the signal to the brain that how much they're eating, so they tend to eat more calories. They looked at that. Food choices in terms of the snacks that they were giving them as well were either UPF or whole food snacks. And what they looked at is it was a smallish study, 20 weight stable adults, 10 women, 10 men. And they did it for 2 weeks. So it was a 28-day study. So they had ultra processed or unprocessed diet ad libitum. So they could eat as much as they want. For 2 weeks, followed immediately by the other diet for the other 2 weeks. And then they had 3 daily meals. They could, again, consume as much or as little as they wanted. They had up to an hour for each meal, and they were matched for calories, energy density, macronutrients, fiber, sugars, and sodium, but differed in the percentage of calories derived from ultra-processed versus unprocessed foods. So what you see here is in the ultra-processed meals, a proportion of added to total sugar. You had higher added sugar, about 54% added sugar in ultra-processed meal versus 1 in unprocessed meals. Insoluble to total fiber. So you had greater insoluble to total fiber in the unprocessed meals. So it's not just fiber. As we know, fiber is not this monolith. There's soluble and insoluble fiber. They're different types, and they're in different ratios when you're looking at whole foods. So they were sort of trying to match that. Saturated to total fat, so greater saturated fat in ultra-processed meals, and greater omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the ultra-processed meals. Back down to the cost. Why do people choose ultra-processed for unprocessed versus unprocessed food? It costs them, for 2,000 calories per day, $106 for the ultra-processed meal, for the food for the whole day. Versus $151, so almost 50% more for the unprocessed meals. And they bought the ingredients, by the way, at local supermarkets in the Maryland, Washington, D.C. area. So they were shopping for these foods and getting them just like a consumer would. Not to mention the time. Like if you're preparing your meals from scratch, we all know how much more time that costs versus these more convenient UPF industrially produced foods. So basically, calories from UPFs, you're looking at about 81.3% of the calories in the UPF in the UPF meals. So here are some samples of the foods that they produce, or they gave them. So day one for the ultra processed foods, Honey Nut Cheerios. A lot of these will already, everybody's going to recognize these brands, and blueberry muffins, whole milk, margarine. The second day, croissants, margarine, turkey sausage, blueberry yogurt, Yoplait with Nutrisource fiber added into it. And those are just 2 of the days. I just gave a couple of samples. If you look at the study, actually, in the added information in the study, there are actually photos you can get that shows the plates of the meals, and it was really fascinating to look at. For lunch, beef ravioli, Parmesan cheese, white bread, diet lemonade. Right, diet lemonade is supposed to be healthier, right? Because it's diet. Day 2 also, you've got for lunch deli turkey with cheese, quesadilla. Refined, remember the quesadilla, because I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Sour cream, salsa, lemonade, dinner, steak and gravy, mashed potatoes, all pre-made, Tyson's, McCormick's, diet lemonade again. Day 2, chicken salad. You can read these. And then snacks, Lay's potato chips, baked, right? Don't we all know that baked potato chips are supposed to be healthier than fried, right? So people with all good intention are trying to choose things that are supposedly healthier. Dry roasted peanuts, peanut butter and sandwich crackers, goldfish, applesauce. For the unprocessed meals then, to me, much more appealing. Yogurt, parfait with strawberries, bananas, walnuts, little olive oil, apple, scrambled eggs, apple slices. Sorry, that's an error here. This should be slices. Apple slices, comma, scrambled eggs, hash browns, lunch, spinach salad, chicken breast, apple slices, fresh squeezed lemon juice. So you're not looking at the diet lemonade, apple cider vinegar, entree salad, and that's all that was on that on the meal. And then an entree salad was another example of a lunch: chicken breast, baked potato with a nice vinaigrette, a red wine vinaigrette with olive oil, apple slices. Then dinner here, you can look at these daily snacks instead of the processed package. You've got oranges, apples, raisins, raw almonds, chopped walnuts. So you can all see quite stark differences in the options people had. And like I mentioned, and the prices that it would take to eat this way. So here are the results. What you had is that those people eating the ultra processed foods consumed about almost 460 calories more per day than unprocessed meals. That's a huge difference. Results did not differ based on the diet order, whether they started with the ultra processed diet first or the processed diet first and then switch. It didn't matter, or whether it was male or female. Didn't matter. They thought the energy intake, the increase was due to greater carbohydrates and fat, but not protein. So it's really the carbohydrate and fat intake that accounted, and then not protein, that accounted for the higher energy intake. And they also consumed significantly more sodium, the people consuming the ultra processed foods. So the meal eating rate, like I mentioned, they were eating faster. So it was greater during the ultra processed diet, whether it was expressed as kilocalories per minute or grams per minute. Either way, the rate of consuming the food was significantly faster in the ultra processed, people eating the ultra processed diets versus the unprocessed diets. And here you see the energy intakes with breakfast, dinner, and lunch. The blue is the ultra processed, and the red is the unprocessed. And at every meal, what you have is greater energy take in the ultra processed foods, diets with every meal compared to the unprocessed. And in terms of whether they felt hunger, so this is the visual analog scale, hunger, fullness, satisfaction, or eating capacity, there's no statistically significant differences. So they all reported, whether it was the ultra processed or unprocessed food, satisfaction with the foods. So you can't say, well, the ultra processed foods just tasted better, they were more satisfied, so that's why they were eating more. No, that doesn't show in the data. So weight gain, just in 2 weeks, you see almost a 1 kilogram increase in weight in people eating the ultra processed diet versus about a 1 kilogram, 0.9 kilogram loss in weight. People losing weight on the more whole foods unprocessed diet. So that's what is it, a 1.8 kilogram difference in just 2 weeks between the groups. So weight gain correlated with energy intake differences, and body fat mass increased by 0.4 kilograms with the ultra processed diet, but dropped by 0.3 kilograms in the unprocessed diet. So I loved this, and I put this into a summary slide because they unlike other studies, they also looked at laboratory data. This is the first study ever to do this. So it's not just that people are eating faster. It's not obviously that they're more satisfied with the food. What we're seeing here is hormonal changes happening. So when you look at, and this is just after 2 weeks. So in the the ultra processed, I'm going to just focus on a few of these. Active GLP-1 went down significantly, significant decrease in GLP-1. So we know that when you give GLP-1, it reduces hunger, and their GLP-1 actually decreased. No significant change in people eating the unprocessed foods. I'm going to jump down here down to thyroid. So you see it's borderline significant, trending toward it, 0.054. But what is interesting to me here, and people having the ultra processed foods, their TSH went up, it increased to 2.6. So the American College or American Academy of Endocrinology, I think it was back in 2005 or 2006, changed their recommendation for a high TSH of 2.5. And so this is above that cutoff. Obviously, we want to look at symptoms, and they did not do an interview with these patients to see if any of the symptoms correlated with hypothyroidism or not. But we do see that this increase. And my question is, if they'd followed this diet for longer than 2 weeks, would the thyroid TSH continue to go up? Would it be statistically significant if they ate this way, like most people do, for weeks, months, and years at a time? Could that be accounting for some thyroid dysfunction in our patients? Similarly, though, or what's interesting in the unprocessed diet, when you look at free T4 and T3, it improved. It went up, significant increases. So better thyroid function, and CRP went down. And CRP did not change in the UPF group. As I mentioned, the addictive quality of UPF meets the addiction standards and definitions that was defined for tobacco consumption. It causes compulsive use, highly controlled or compulsive use. Psychoactive mood-altering changes occur, and it reinforces the behavior. So they grab for it, they eat it, they have changes in their chemistry, changes in their moods, and then they grab for more. They want more. When they essentially, as I'm interpreting it, they start coming down from the high, right? Then they want to grab more UPF. I mean, who in here hasn't had the experience, frankly, of opening a bag of chips and saying, I'm only going to eat 2 or 3 or just for a few, and half the bag or 3/4 of the bag is done before you even know what's happening? I mean, who's experienced that? Right? Not surprising. Also triggers strong urges or cravings. So carbohydrates and added fats are most implicated in this, but I think that this research, as time goes on, might be updated if people start to look at the food additives that are in these products and the behavioral changes that those cause. Those have not been factored into the research yet. So they disrupt our neuroendocrine system. I already showed you some hormonal changes based on the clinical trial. And what you have when you're looking at the reward system in food, it's really the story, the interface between two systems. So one guides, hedonic pleasure, that feeling, that joy you get from doing something, that hedonic appetite when you eat something, whether it's the crunchiness in your mouth, or the elevated blood sugar, and that feeling, you just feel good when you eat it. And the other is what you're eating to gain nutrition and fuel, that sort of sensory and metabolic fullness. So hedonic hunger can be stimulated by extrinsic factors. So it's not all just about what's in the food, it's how the food's being marketed to us and to our children. So food advertisements, the smell of the food. I mean, who hasn't walked by some fast food restaurant and smelled that grease or that salt and that fat and started to crave it? The negative mood, who's emotional eating, and seeing others eat. Behavior is definitely contagious. So when I talk about food and its impact on health, and when I talk about genetics, especially when I've talked about the genetics of osteoporosis, there is an assumption where, not just with osteoporosis, that many diseases, well, if your parents had it and now you have it, or maybe your grandmother had it and your mother had osteoporosis, now you have osteoporosis, you're a woman, well, it's just genetic, it runs in your family. Well, nobody's ever shown that. That's an assumption. But what has been shown that people do inherit is the diet and the lifestyle of their parents. And so a more likely explanation, I believe, than genetics is that people are eating and living like their parents ate. So parents are busy now and often working 2 jobs or more to get by, a 2-income household. And so they're shopping for convenience, they're shopping for low cost, they're feeding their children more and more of these ultra processed foods. So they're getting a taste and they're learning that this is the right way to eat and consume. And as they get older, they're going to carry this on, not only into how they are feeding themselves and their families, but it's also they're setting up a lifetime of diseases down the road for themselves and the next generation. All right, back to this different interfaces in the reward system. So then you have the exteroceptive pathways that sort of activated by anticipation. So visual or olfactory cues in the environment, and contextual stimuli. So just walking into a certain place or seeing something where you expect there to be a reward. And then another pathway, the interoceptive pathway, more internal. So satiety signals activating that. So gastric distension, and the hormones then for satiety, like ghrelin, leptin. And that goes back also to eating fast. If they're eating quickly, those satiety signals, that interoceptive pathways, aren't being able to be activated in a timely manner to tell people that they're full and they should stop eating, that they don't need to eat anymore. This is rarely part of the story, and this is what I hope becomes more part of the story in the coming years, and that's all the food additives. I've mentioned that a couple of times now. Over 10,000 food additives in the US and 2,000 in the European Union. And they're so that foods can primarily withstand the processing, the heating, the extrusion process, the other chemicals that are involved. It has nothing to do with any type of nutritional value to the food. So this is a partial list of categories. So within each of these categories, I mean, dozens and dozens, hundreds of examples, but flavors, flavor enhancers, colors, emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose. And I include these by name because I'm going to talk about some data on those two. Artificial sweeteners, so non-caloric sweeteners, thickeners, humectants, stabilizers, acidity regulators, preservatives, antioxidants, foaming agents, anti-foaming agents. So you got things that foam, things that keep things from foaming, bulking agents, bleaching agents, leavening agents. It's exhausting just reading that, and even more. So let's just look at synthetic sweeteners. So acesulfame, potassium, advantame, aspartame, neotame, saccharin, sucralose. Those are some of the names of them. This is data from NHANES, 2 different time periods. So 25% of children and 41% of adults are consuming synthetic sweeteners. 80% of children and 56% of adults are consuming them once a day. And the frequency increases with body weight. So the more somebody with obesity, you can be assuming that they're consuming these sweeteners more often. It's happening at home. 72% of children are getting it at home, and 72% of adults are consuming them at home. And you're looking at a lot of these products that are out there, these low calorie, diet labeled products, things that people are consciously think they're making healthier choices for themselves and their family because that's what they've been taught, that's what they've been told. And in fact, they're consuming higher and higher amounts of these synthetic sweeteners that are having some damaging health impacts. And they're being consumed with meals. So yogurt sweetened with synthetic sweeteners is 25% of total yogurt intake in adults and 10% in children. So that is one of the major routes by which they're being exposed to that. Non-caloric artificial sweeteners, lots of studies have been done on this. Induce glucose intolerance, includes the mechanisms, but it decreases insulin sensitivity, increases caloric intake. So, right, you're doing a diet, you're saying I'm going to buy a food that's labeled diet that has 0 calories from sugar because it has these artificial sugars. And what happens then is people actually increase more calories. They consume more calories. And it also alters the gut microbiome. So people who consume 1 or more artificially sweetened beverages a day have a higher risk for type 2 diabetes. And a meta-analysis of 21 studies after adjusting for weight, 8% greater risk of diabetes in those who regularly drank artificially sweetened beverages. Polysorbate 80, it's an emulsifier. So these things also go by different names, so it can be a little hard to recognize them on packages. So polyoxyethylene 20 and sorbitan monoleate. And you can read that. It's just chemical goo, really. And what you're looking at in terms of the FDA is a lot of these regulations that were done years ago where they were not exposing the animals to proportionally the same amount that we're being exposed to now because they're a lot more being used more prevalently in foods and people are being exposed to them because they're eating more PF foods. The FDA is allowing this in ice cream, frozen custard, ice milk, frozen sherbet. This is directly from the regulation. Non-standardized frozen desserts. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I'm sure a lawyer has defined that. Yeast defoamer formulations, and as a solubilizing and dispersing agent in pickles, pickle products, in fat-soluble vitamins, in vitamin and mineral preparations. So I have an example later of an over-the-counter dietary supplement that actually has this in it. In ice cream, it contributes to that smooth, creamy feeling. So that smooth, creamy feeling in ice cream, historically, ice cream is what? Milk and fat and sugar. Well, you replace it with this because it keeps it from thawing out as fast, and it gives that creamy mouth flavor texture. And then also it has a longer shelf life because dairy products can go rancid faster. So if you can remove the fat and replace it with an emulsifier, you're reducing your costs. You can truck it farther. You can store it longer. People have that creamy mouthfeel, but they're not actually getting the calories from dairy. So as an anti-foaming agent, it ensures confections are set correctly and it disperses water so that flour and bread doesn't clump, giving a lump feel batter or dough. So carboxymethylcellulose, CMC, and polysorbate 80, they both induce low-grade inflammation, obesity, and metabolic syndrome in mice. Interestingly, and this is really important with the microbiome connection, germ-free animals do not experience obesity when fed emulsifiers. So remember that. In mice, altered gut microbiota
was changed, and behavioral changes were also noted when they were fed this. They had altered anxiety-like behaviors in males and social behaviors in females. So the way that affected the behavior in the mice was sex dependent. And this also may go back to those behavioral changes in children with ADHD and behavioral changes in adults when it comes to anxiety and depression. There may be a microbiome connection here with gut flora. So you have changes in agouti-related peptide and alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone in both sexes, and those are implicated in feeding and social and anxiety-related behaviors. So AGRP stimulates food intake and reduces anxiety-like behaviors, and while MSH inhibits food intake and increases anxiety-like behaviors. So this is consistent with increased food intake in a previous study. So this has then now been repeated, at least in 2 studies, it's been shown. It promotes, both of these promote colitis in a mouse model of IBD, with CMC aggravating colitis significantly more than polysorbate 80 without altering the microbiome. So even without changing the microbiome, you had an aggravation of IBD. However, CMC significantly decreased the number of bacteriophages. So it may be that it's not directly killing or altering the microbiome directly. It might be that it's reducing the number of bacteriophages that are then keeping in check the pathogenic bacteria in the microbiome. So the story is still being teased apart, but the end result is the same. The microbiome is being affected. And it's changing behavior in mice, feeding behavior, and anxiety and social behaviors. So they looked at 17 different emulsifiers in this study on the mice microbiome. And by the way, just a quick note back to inflammatory bowel disease. In the previous study looking at these emulsifiers, obviously with IBD in humans, we want to help them improve their diet. One of the things that I don't hear talked about when it comes to IBD are the food additives and emulsifiers. That may be something to be on your radar while you're talking to patients about, and cleaning up their diet, something to consider as a possible aggravator. Yes. There have been, and that's a great question. I don't have the data. I know that those also create issues, but I don't have the data at the tip of my tongue, and I did not include it in here. I apologize for that. That was a great question. So these emulsifiers, there are 17 of them that were looked at. Compared to controls, the alpha diversity, that means the microbiome was significantly reduced, meaning the number of different genera was significantly reduced by all of these different types of emulsifiers. So not just CMC and P80, but all of these different ones, not all 17, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the 17. Xanthan gum, guar gum, blocospine gum, I see that frequently. If you look in the list of ingredients in packaged foods, it's often the last several ingredients.
Maltodextrin that's in many of our supplements.
Yeah, maltodextrin as well. It is a lot. Yeah, good point. Maltodextrin is a lot of supplements. Yeah. So the gut microbiome, women who consume more than 5 servings per day of UPFs, they had an increase in all of these bacteria here. I'm not going to go through all the names. And they had a decrease in these other bacteria. And bifidobacter and actinobacteria were positively associated with pizza, and actinobacteria was associated with industrially processed dairy in women. So I don't know what the health impacts of all of that necessarily are, but just this is more evidence showing like the microbiome is being affected by these foods. Similarly, in men, you had an effect on the microbiome, but different bacteria were being affected. I don't know why in the different sexes it would be different, but that's what this study showed. And carrageenan. So it's a thickener, it's a stabilizer, it's an emulsifier. It improves that mouthfeel, the smoothness, the mouthfeel of food. So it's in chocolate milk, ice cream, cottage cheese, sour cream, processed meats. Even if you start looking at, those healthy alternatives that are marketed as such, like the protein drinks, OWYN, I think it's OWYN, has this in it or has a gum in it. There's high protein, low sugar drinks, have these emulsifiers, these stabilizers, thickeners in them. And what you see is that it increases tumor necrosis alpha towards an inflammatory picture, rather towards apoptosis, and suggests that it may compromise the effectiveness of alpha tumor necrosis alpha therapy. Again, no studies looking, no controlled clinical trials on that, but I think this is really intriguing research. So looking at colonic human epithelial cells, it triggered a distinct inflammatory pathway via activation of BCL10 with NF-kappa beta activation and upregulation of interleukin-8 secretion. So they're speculating that this could be the link between a genetic predisposition and environmental triggers for IBD. Monoglycerides and diglycerides of fatty acids. I see this a lot on food labels as well. So that's an emulsifier. They contain hydrogenated fats. So looking for a prospective study out of France with over 95,000 adults. Total consumption of these. They had about 204.5 milligrams per day as a median. And then the median interquartile range was 123.7 milligrams per day. The higher intake was associated with increased cardiovascular disease risk, increased coronary heart disease risk, and increased cerebrovascular disease risk. Now, we know that hydrogenated fats increase cardiovascular disease risk, and yet monoglyceride and diglyceride of fatty acids are still being used in packaged foods. Food coloring. Lots of food colors. Red number 3, red number 40, yellow number 5, yellow number 6. 27 clinical trials were reviewed. They were all crossover designs. The children's exposure, this was in the US, the average food coloring dose, they were being exposed to 55.8 milligrams per day of food coloring. Now, that's a pretty big range, but look at this, all the way up to 250 milligrams per day of food coloring. And they conclude here, and it's a quote, current evidence from studies in humans, largely from controlled exposure studies in children, supports a relationship between food dye exposure and adverse behavioral outcomes in children, both with and without pre-existing behavioral disorders, aka ADHD. Back to the ADHD picture, not just sweetened foods, but it's the food additives as well. None of this is being screened for conventionally. As naturopathic doctors, I remember learning about food additives in ADHD in school. But you can almost be guaranteed that if a patient comes to you, a child with a diagnosis of ADHD, they've likely not been their parents have never had a discussion with their primary healthcare provider, if it's a conventionally trained doctor, about food additives and the relationship with behavioral challenges. Probably sugar, probably maybe protein, but likely not food additives like food coloring. So ingredients. So interestingly, and I wanted to bring up scope here on the left because of the polysorbate 80. So we know that polysorbate 80 changes the microbiome when consumed, but here people are swishing with it every day, maybe twice a day. What effect is that having on the oral microbiome? We don't know. That's never been studied. Here, healthy iron supplement, right? Every nature made. It's got huge distribution around the country, and it's got polysorbate 80 in it. You look here, Baskin-Robbins ice cream, mono and diglycerides, guar gum, carrageenan, polysorbate 80. Even in the healthier type foods that are marketed as healthy. So you've got this dairy-free soy ice cream, and you've got guar gum and locust bean gum. Welch's fruit snacks, red 40, blue number 1. Mission organic, it has to be good. It's flour tortilla, it's organic. guar gum, xanthan gum, carrageenan, 3 different types of emulsifiers. What about food packaging itself, not just the food? Well, a study came out in 2024, just this year, and they looked at a database of chemicals and looked at what's used in food packaging, and then look at samples, tissue samples, and data from humans. And what they found is that 25% of food contact chemicals, those are chemicals in food, coming in contact with the packaging, 25% of those were found in humans. And that exposure has been linked to cancer, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, endocrine disruption, bioaccumulation, or persistence. And toxicity data for many of these chemicals were missing or incomplete. So examples, everybody's heard of bisphenol A and phthalates, alternative plasticizers also, metals like lead, flame retardants, PFAS, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds, all part of that picture. So it's not necessarily just what's in the food, but it's also the food packaging. And you have to realize also that in some of when you're looking at transporting these food products for long periods of time, they could be sitting in trucks. They're not a lot of the times refrigerated unless it's required. And so they could be exposed to heat, and they could be left in those packages for months at a time. That really gives that opportunity for those chemicals to migrate from the packaging and into the food. So strategies for talking to patients. This is where I would love some input also from doctors here. I think this is an important part of having a discussion of how to help patients understand what they can do, because you're not going to find one messaging strategy, I don't believe, that works for every patient, really tailoring them and just saying, don't eat this way or eat more whole foods. It's not realistic. It might not be in people's budgets. They might not have time. Really understanding where you can start moving the needle in that direction. Plus, in general, what I found in people who are eating this way, if you want them to eat to migrate to a more whole foods diet, radical changes done overnight tend not to be sustainable. So it's about helping people move in whatever time frame is comfortable and accessible to them, towards an eating pattern that creates healthier habits so that they can learn how to eat for health and to promote their health for the rest of their life, not just do a rapid, quick change and then they're just going to swing back to what they did before. So these are some of the things that I like to think about when talking with patients and other people. If it's not an ingredient in your kitchen, avoid it. I actually got that from a book that I read this year, which I think is phenomenal, called Ultra Processed People. It opened my eyes to this issue and got me interested in researching this deeper. I really recommend that book. If you read an ingredient on a label and you don't understand it, don't buy it. I also like to say if it can't mold, don't eat it. If it can't sit on your counter and go bad, avoid it. If you want an extreme experiment, and this is what the author of the book did on himself, he's a researcher, and had his brother do, a twin brother do, is they ate 80% UPF for a while. They actually increased their consumption. They felt so horrible on that diet that they refused to eat it again. So they eliminated UPFs almost entirely from their diet after that experiment. This is my old slide. So I actually submitted, based on feedback, second version of this. So this is missing a couple of slides. So there are other things that you can do in terms of motivational interviewing with patients as well that might be helpful for them. Patients also, if you give them some ideas of substitutes that might be easier for them to do, might be helpful. For example, instead of buying Yoplait, buy an unsweetened yogurt and add a little maple syrup to it. Things like that, where they can still have some of that sweetness or that flavor as they're transitioning. One of the things that happens, like everything in our body, our taste buds will adapt to what is considered sweet. And so as people if you have somebody who's eating a high UPF diet, is eating a lot of, sugar and very sweet foods, then when they eat an apple, that actually might not taste sweet to them, and their body might not like it. So over time, talk to them how their taste buds are going to adapt over time. And I like to have people focus really on just two categories: protein and fiber. So I talked about protein yesterday, calculate how much protein they should be getting in a day, and then 30 grams of total dietary fiber from whole foods. And I said, look, transition into that over 4 to 6 weeks, whatever comfortable with you. And I give them handouts. I give them snack ideas, because it requires shopping differently, oftentimes, different behavioral patterns, maybe having different snacks in the house. If their family's involved, they've got to get the family involved as well. Having different spices in the house, managing their time differently, budgeting differently. So there's a lot involved, and it's a complicated process. So I say, start moving in this direction over 4 to 6 weeks, whatever's comfortable for you. But if you could do this for 6 days out of the week, that's it. Just follow this way of eating: 30 grams of dietary fiber, your minimum amount of protein per day for 6 days a week. On the 7th day, eat whatever you want. Doesn't matter. Go crazy. Inevitably, almost every time somebody's come back after doing that for a couple of weeks, I typically do a follow-up appointment a couple of weeks later once they've started doing that. They feel really good for those 6 days. And then they eat like crap on the 7th day, and they feel like crap. And so part of the challenge is people are at such a low level of health and how they're feeling. They don't even understand that they're not feeling as good as they can. That's their normal. So part of it also is starting to re-engineer, rebalance their physiology at a healthier level so they feel healthier, and they just have an awareness of, wait a minute, life can be better, and all I've got to do is change how I'm eating, and I can feel these effects. And that helps motivate people to continue, hopefully, down this path. That's what I've found to be helpful. So I think we've got a few minutes left if we've got any questions.
One of my strategies, John, is I also tell people to eat closer to the way God put it on the planet.
I like that. Did everybody hear that? So eat closer to the way God put it on the planet.
You talk about, then you talk about older, then you talk about cream of wheat, then you talk about it bread, right? I mean, it's like the closer you eat it to the way God put it on the planet, the healthier it's gonna be.
Right. Yeah. Any other strategies, comments? Yes, sir. I look, only that I try to just say minimize the exposure to highly processed oils, just in general, as an overall rule. It's going to be impossible to completely avoid all of them. But for example, if you're having you look at salad dressings that are on the shelves in supermarkets, most of them don't have really healthy oils in them. And I prefer, and I tell people, just use olive oil and a good high quality balsamic. Or again, use some of these strategies. If you don't know what the ingredient is, avoid it. Or again, it's going to be impossible to completely eliminate from our lives ultra processed food and these toxic chemicals. It's about trying to minimize the exposure, ideally below at least the thresholds that have been shown to create risk factors for these chronic diseases is my takeaway from the research. We just got to do the best job we could do at
And
this
we
point.
as a profession need to start talking to the supplement companies.
Right.
I mean, Mary Bo has been fighting that for years.
Yeah.
Magnesium stearate shouldn't be in our
Yeah.
supplements.
Yeah. And I
And glass bottles and versus plastic.
So I own a supplement company, so I really don't feel like I can comment any further on that. Because I don't want to violate CE rules, I guess. Yes. Yeah. So I think it depends on the product. So if I look at what protein powders, for example, which is common, it's hard for people to get the minimum amount of protein through their diet that I and the research recommends. So a lot of people are going to need to supplement with a protein powder. Some protein powders are going to have the gums in there. So I just avoid those if you can. In terms of other packaged foods, look, you can say the fewer ingredients, maybe the healthier. It's hard. There's so many categories of additives. You know, it's not an easy answer to give to say just avoid this or just avoid this. I believe there's probably, when all is said and done in the research over the next decade, as this continues, I think what's going to be found is there's going to be additive and synergistic effects of how these different additives are interacting with each other in the microbiome and our endocrinology to create all of these problems. So I think just avoid this category or just avoid this nutrient is not the way that I really think about it. And I don't have an easy answer for you. I'm sorry, but I don't think there is an easy answer. Yes. I don't typically, but if they do, I really want them to choose ones that have, again, not these additives in them, and they're out there. Yeah.
All right, thank you, John.
Yeah.